I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us for this virtual event, Lasting Impressions, Hand Printing in Practice. I'm Kelly Kress, Senior Accessioning Archivist at the Huntington, and this event is part of an ongoing webinar series produced by the library's Reader Services Department called the Multi-Storied Library. I'm co-chair of the Multi-Storied Library Committee, and I want to give a quick shout out to co-chair Jasmine Rue Pincham and the rest of the team of Stephanie Arias, Anne Blacksmith, Cynthia Captain, Natalie Lawler, and Holly Mendenhall, and also special thanks to our AV team of David, Mikey, and Gabe. I should mention that this presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be available later on the Huntington's website. Attendees are welcome to post any questions in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentations. Today, we'll be doing a deep dive into printer William Morris and the Kelmscott Press. The Huntington Library holds one of the largest collections of Kelmscott Press books in the world, and our panelists will talk about Morris's unique printing techniques and the Kelmscott Press books in the Huntington's collections. You'll also learn how a rare book cataloger describes these materials, as well as how to discover Kelmscott Press and printing history resources online, and learn how Huntington services can help jumpstart your research. We're joined today by our three fabulous panelists. Sarah Francis is the Assistant Curator of Literary Collections. She received her master's degree in Library and Information Science with an emphasis on print and visual culture from UCLA. She has both personal and scholarly interest and experience in bookmaking and letterpress printing and has been with the Huntington since 2022. Dorothy Auyong is Cataloging Manager in the Library Technical Services Department. She has master's degrees in European history and in library and information science from UCLA. She has worked at the Huntington for 29 years. Jasmine Rue Pincham is the Assistant Access Services Librarian in the Reader Services Department. She has been in several roles in the library division at the Huntington over 6 years. She earned her master's in library and information science from San Jose State University. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. All right, next slide, please. Okay, we'll get started. In the second half of the 19th century, the name of British designer and artist William Morris became synonymous with fine craftsmanship. He was a man of many interests and activities, and whether he was designing home furnishings, entire rooms, stained glass windows, or books, he was known for his attention to detail. He was also known for his references to medieval craft and visual culture, augmented by a distinctly contemporary perspective. Here at the Huntington, we have one of the largest collections of William Morris material in the world, shared between our art museum and our library. The library's holdings, which we'll be looking at today, focus on archival material related to William Morris as an individual and material related to his Kelmscott Press, a printing house and publisher he founded in 1891 that continued until his death in 1896, wrapping up operations in 1898. In that time, the Kelmscott Press printed 53 books in 66 volumes, and despite a mere 7-year run, the Kelmscott Press's reach was vast, effectively kicking off the modern fine press movement. Today, we're going to look at some Kelmscott Press publications and some of the 15th century incunables, which are books printed in Europe through the year 1500 that inspired William Morris's design choices. We'll also look at some styles of book design common in the late 19th century after the Industrial Revolution had forever changed the way books were manufactured, and which Morris was specifically critiquing with his designs. Next slide, please. Morris chose to print his books on a hand press, which is a manual printing press, even though it would have been more efficient and cost-effective to use a steam-powered press. So before we get into the details of what made Kelmscott Press books different, we'll take a look at how printing is done on a hand press. And the video that we'll see was created by the Museum Planten Moretus in Antwerp, and we'll put a link to it in the chat as well. Okay, so the first thing our pressman does is prepare some printing ink by spreading it out very thinly. And he's then going to take a pair of what are called ink balls and work ink into each one. These are covered in leather historically. Okay, and then he's going to apply the ink to the form, which describes the whole arrangement of individual pieces of lead type, with each letter getting its own piece, which have been arranged in order and then locked together tightly using what we call wooden furniture. He's then going to place a piece of paper on what's called a tympan. There's a watermark there that you can see. And then that piece of paper is held in place partly by a frisket, which is cut specifically for this job, and it keeps the paper from flopping onto the form. And then he lowers that under the platen. And the pressman lowers the platen onto the form before applying pressure, which creates an impression. Or he rolls it into the platen. And now a 15th century press would have been made of wood, but William Morris used an iron hand press because it could exert more pressure with a much smaller footprint. So I'll watch this all one more time. We're applying the ink to the form. Putting the paper on the tympan, lowering the frisket on top of that, rolling it under the platen, lowering the platen onto the form and applying pressure, rolling it out, and then we can see the printed page. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and speaking of those iron presses, we actually have one of William Morris's presses here at the Huntington. It lives outside of the Director of Research's office, but you can see it's much smaller than the press we saw in the video. And of course, it's crucial to note that innovations in printing in the 19th century helped bring down the cost of books and spread literacy. The books Morris was influenced by and printed himself were expensive and primarily available to individuals with money. But Morris argued that some design elements could be applied no matter the cost of materials, like the use of his preferred typefaces, which we commonly call fonts today. Good typefaces could be used on even cheap paper. And it's also worth noting that Morris was a designer, but he did not print. That was the domain of a trained pressman. Morris wasn't the only person advocating for older styles of type and design, but he was one of very few printers doing it thoughtfully, cohesively, and well, and seemingly out of reverence for the principles and not just nostalgia. Other printers were using shortcuts to emulate older techniques, mostly just for the sake of, quote, quaintness. He could both eloquently discuss and execute beautiful design. And of course, this won't be an exhaustive discussion of the Kelmscott Press by any means, but we'll discuss some of the key differences between what Morris was doing and what other printers of his time were doing, and where he got his inspiration. And we will turn to the books themselves for that. As I mentioned at the top, Morris was influenced by incunables. Incunabula literally means swaddling clothes or cradle in Latin. So essentially, we're referring to the infancy of European printing, which Johannes Gutenberg initiated in Germany in the 1450s. Okay, I'm just going to switch the camera here. Okay. All right, and you should see two books side by side. Okay, here on the right, we have the story of the glittering plane, an original work authored by William Morris. He actually wrote several of the books that the Kelmscott Press printed. We can compare it to a copy of Virgil's works printed in 1877, starting with paper, the foundation of any fine press book. While I didn't point it out in our video, the pressman used paper that had been slightly dampened. You can't tell in the finished product, but Morris used dampened paper as well. You couldn't use dampened paper with a power-driven press because feeding sheets into a power-driven press is automated, and the use of printed paper requires careful hand feeding into the press. But dampened paper creates a much more solid print with deeper impression. A hand press could also ensure quality printing because the pace of printing was slow and allowed for ample time to examine each page. While much cheaper wood pulp paper was in regular use by the 1890s, William Morris wanted to use only paper made from beaten linen rags, which aged better, was more durable, and allowed for a deeper impression of the text on the page. Hopefully you can see the difference between these two types of paper. While they're close in age, the Kelmscott paper is much brighter and thicker. And if you're interested in watching a short video that shows traditional paper making, you can find a link to one in the chat. You can also see the difference in how the ink looks on the page between these two. The text in a typical mid-19th century book looks gray on the page because thin inks were used, which dried more quickly and therefore lent themselves to faster production. The process of finding a thick, strong black ink was long and tedious, but Morris managed to get it from a German supplier. This nearly caused a revolt amongst his pressmen because they found it so difficult to work with. I'll just repeat my last sentence here. Sorry if this is repetitive for anyone, but you might wonder how someone could wait an entire year to sell something into which they'd invested a lot of money. So I should mention here that the Kelmscott Press was a labor of love for Morris. He made a small profit, but he didn't actually need to make a living from the Kelmscott Press, as he was independently wealthy and had another business as well, Morris & Company, which designed home furnishings and other decorative pieces. Okay, so we're going to switch out the book on the left here. Now on the left is an 1850s collection of Herman Melville stories called the Piazza Tales. Note the use of ample white space between the letters, words, and lines. Morris felt that too much space within the text block looked sloppy. It's common to see more space in Victorian books because it's actually more legible to increase the blank space on the page. Effectively, his books, in some instances, are more difficult to read, but the effect is of a solid block of color on the page, which Morris felt was more aesthetically pleasing. He also believed that you should see two facing pages as one unit. So the gutter, which is this inner margin here, is more narrow than the outer margin, unlike the layout of a typical Victorian page where the text block is centered on the page. And I know that that's a bit hard to see because the book is at an angle, but I hope you can at least see the contrast here. What Morris was doing was more in line with medieval manuscripts and incunabula, which typically had wide outer margins for glosses and annotations added by the reader after printing. And it might be a little bit difficult to see here as well, but the bottom margin is the largest because that's where you put your hands. And Morris didn't stop at designing layouts. He also felt very strongly about typography or the design of letter forms, and he was a calligrapher, which informed his designs. Morris openly hated many of the typefaces that were popular in the 19th century, which typically had thinner letter forms like we see here on the left. We're going to magnify that a bit. These typefaces were considered more refined and modern at the time, with the added benefit of requiring less ink on the page, which allowed for quicker drying of printed sheets. So try to keep this page in your mind's eye as we look at the next example. I'm going to swap out for the Augsburg. Yep, that one. We can compare everything we've been discussing to the kind of books that influenced Morris, like this book printed in Augsburg, Germany around 1473 on the left. Morris wanted to create a more consistent, substantial letter form because they appeared more solid on the page. So he designed 3 different typefaces for the Kelmscott Press: Troy, Chaucer, and Golden. We have examples of Golden and Troy here with us today, and first we'll look at Troy, which Morris designed to be a legible black letter type. Black letter typefaces are the kind we often associate with German printing, and in fact, the earliest printed books do use black letter or Gothic typefaces, which are based on the kind of scribal handwriting that was popular in the region. We'll put a link in the chat to a resource that describes and depicts various regional styles of handwriting and use up until the advent of printing, if you're interested in learning more about that. We can see a black letter typeface in the German incunable on the left. You'll notice that while the incunable is clearly a reference, the Troy typeface on the right has many stylistic elements that make it distinct. While typefaces that are meant to evoke earlier time periods seem totally normal to us now, the idea was relatively new in the late 19th century. We're going to switch the one on the right to the smaller, and then switch to the Dorothy. Yep. And then take a minute to set up two totally new books. So switching gears, the other typeface we'll look at, Golden, evokes the Italian humanist letter forms we see in this Italian book on the left called De Officiis, printed in Rome around 1473. And just out of frame, you can see a notation like we were just discussing, or an annotation. Morris's typeface, which we see here in a book of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's poems on the right, aims to reference pen strokes, like those of a calligrapher. So it's also based on scribal handwriting, albeit a different style than the handwriting that influenced black letter typefaces. I recognize this may be a bit hard to see, especially, let's see if we can get a little closer with this, because I think sorry, this one's quite a bit smaller than the other book, but I think we can see it. Okay. So I recognize this might be a bit hard to see, but if you can, compare the uppercase Q of these two typefaces. Yep. Okay. Both have this very distinctive long tail. And then the uppercase ends are also nearly identical. See if we can find a couple of those as well. Yep. So as you can see, compared to Troy, this Kelmscott typeface is much truer to the reference. To glaring clone and to the first page. Okay. Because our time is limited today, we unfortunately can't get very deeply into William Morris's illustration choices, but we can see that Morris was inspired, at least partly, by hand illumination in medieval incunables and manuscripts. We can see how illumination like that on the first page of De Officiis would have inspired the border on this Kelmscott page. And then let's look at the title page. Not every choice Morris made was just for the sake of adhering to medieval design principles. Morris saw his books as an extension of the incunables he loved rather than replicas. For example, speaking of title pages, they weren't commonly in use in the 15th century, but they certainly were by the 19th. What we see on the left is not a title page, it's simply the first page of the text. The line at the top of the page is called an incipit, meaning here begins in Latin, and it introduces us to the text. You'll hear a bit more about incipits in the next presentation. When designing his title pages, because Morris didn't necessarily have references to look to, he was much freer to innovate. And personally, I'm glad he did, because I think his title pages are stunning, and in my opinion, sometimes the most exciting parts of a Kelmscott Press publication. Rossetti also has a stunning title page, which we'll float right over. These title pages are really a hallmark of Kelmscott Press publications. Again, what we're looking at here is influence, not imitation. Okay, and the last thing we'll look at is binding. We'll close these two up. Many Kelmscott books were bound with what we call a limp vellum binding. You could compare it to a paperback, but with vellum instead of cardstock. Vellum is made of calf skin, and you can even see the hair follicles on the cover of this Italian book. Vellum was totally out of fashion by the 1890s, in part because it was a really expensive way to bind books compared to contemporaneous bindings. But Morris loved the look, and when done well, it can be a really durable binding, like we see in our well-used 1473 Italian book, still hanging on 550 years later. But when made inexpertly, or when not handled often, or depending on the environment in which they were kept, vellum bindings can become rigid, like what we see here on the right. It might be a little bit tough to see, but hopefully you can tell that that cover is really standing up on its own. Many of the Kelmscott Press books look like this today, in part because they quickly became collector's items and therefore weren't handled in the same way an incunable would have been. We can see the incunable's influence on the Kelmscott binding and even on the ties that are meant to close each. And I just want to end by making clear that William Morris was a visionary. In the face of dreary industrialization, he imagined a different world in which people were surrounded by beauty, a concept far removed from the lives of most people in industrial Victorian England. We live in a time when reverence for the handmade is familiar, but we have William Morris partly to thank for that. As I mentioned at the top of my presentation, the Kelmscott Press really invigorated the pursuit of the ideal book, and that continues today. There are many contemporary printers like Auyong Press in San Francisco, striving to make beautiful books the, quote, old-fashioned way. If you're interested in learning more about William Morris, you've certainly come to the right place. You can find a guide to our library and art museum holdings on the LibGuide for this presentation, and it is a work in progress, so make sure to check back in a week or so for the full guide. I also want to cite my sources. I relied heavily on William S. Peterson's 1991 book, The Kelmscott Press, for this presentation, which is a highly readable and useful reference work if you want to learn more than you ever thought you could about the Kelmscott Press. And Jasmine will tell us a bit more about secondary sources later on in this presentation. And lastly, if you're interested in doing your own letterpress printing, there are plenty of local places where you can learn more about it or even sign up for classes like the International Print Museum in Carson, the Armory, and Art Center in Pasadena has extension courses as well. And the very last thing I want to mention is that there are digitized versions of the Kelmscott Press books we discussed here today, and also a few others in the LibGuide we created for this presentation. So now I'll turn over to Dorothy, our cataloging manager in the Library Technical Services Department, who's going to speak a bit about the challenges of cataloging books like the ones we've seen today.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, I'm Dorothy Auyong, the cataloging manager in our Technical Services Department in the library. As Sarah has shown, hand-pressed books can record a rich and fascinating history of the transmission of written information, readership, and the creative process over the centuries. Variations amongst copies occur because of the nature of hand-pressed technology. Likewise, evidence of past ownership, binding, readership markings, book plates, inscriptions, etc. can all be informative. The job of the rare book cataloger is to provide information about these details in the catalog record so that researchers can identify which copies might be useful in their research. In addition to our extensive William Morris collection, the Huntington also has a large holding of hand-pressed era books. We have one of the largest pre-18th century books in North America. We are second in size to the Library of Congress for pre-1500 century books or incunabula. Here's a look at the catalog record for our copy of De Officiis printed in Rome around 1473, which Sarah discussed. I'll walk you through some of the elements of a catalog record and some of the areas a rare book cataloger needs to focus on. The title and publication areas are known as transcription areas, which means that the information is taken as it appears on the object itself. The square brackets surrounding information indicate that it was not found on the object itself, but was supplied by the cataloger. In this case, the place, printer, and date, referred to collectively as the imprint, were taken from reference materials. The note highlighted explains where the information came from. Square brackets in the description field indicate unnumbered pages, leaves, or plates. Here, the cataloger supplied a total number of pages in the work, which was 88. Sometimes this information is not easy to find. As you can see, early hand-pressed books often do not have a title page, as Sarah mentioned. These title pages don't lay out a listing of the author, title, place of publication, publisher, and date. The title is present in the first line, as is the author, but the publication information is not here. Here's a closer look at the first line of text, or incipit, showing the embedded author and title information. This text literally says, here begins the text. This title page example is from a modern edition of De Officiis in the Internet Archive. You can see a more expected layout with the publication data or imprint. And this is the layout of information we've come to expect with modern English language printed books. As you can see, the title, author, and publication imprint data is clearly laid out on the title page and is easy to copy over into a catalog record. Sometimes the publication information is given at the end of a book or colophon, as in this 1474 edition of De Officiis, or in this more modern colophon from the Glittering Plains that Sarah showed you earlier. However, our 1473 Rome edition of De Officiis lacks that information. Luckily, the very earliest books or incunabula have been studied and cataloged in many institutions, so we were able to consult other reference sources to help us. Both the GW and ISTC resources were able to suggest the relevant information based on their examination and research into other copies. Here is an example of the entry in the Incunabula Short Title Catalog, or ISTC. This is an online specialized catalog or bibliography which focuses on particular types of books, in this case, the very early hand-pressed books or incunabula. Information about different copies around the world can be gathered in one spot. These specialized bibliographies can either be online or in older printed resources. Rare book catalogers need to know about the relevant reference sources for the types of materials they're cataloging. Our colleague Jasmine Ruprinshaw will talk a little bit about this too later on in her presentation. In addition to the transcription elements like title and imprint publication data, which the cataloger copies directly from the item, catalogers supply controlled access points. These are constructed by using various controlled or standardized vocabularies to provide consistent access points to records within and across catalogs. St. Ambrose's name appears in different forms across different editions, depending on when they were published and what language they were in. The Library of Congress Authorities file allows catalogers to use a consistent form of his name throughout the catalog. Here's a more detailed slide of the authorized form of his name to be used in the catalog, as well as other variations that may be found. Title page for the 2020 Oxford University edition in English. As you can see, Ambrose's name is spelled differently. Providing a consistent name is especially useful for printers and publishers. In the hand-press period, their names can often be found in multiple forms and languages and imprints. Here, the name of Venetian printer Octaviano Scotto, who died in 1498, can be found in several different Latin forms. If a user depended on keyword search, they would have to perform multiple searches for all of the possible variations that could appear in imprints. With a controlled access point search, they only need to perform one search to find all of the records in our catalog with his name. There were other access points which utilize controlled vocabularies. Subject headings, forms, and genres. Subject headings are what a work is about. Form and genre terms are what a work or object is, either as a type of work or physical aspects of the object itself. For example, Anne of Green Gables is a novel, and it is fiction. It is about orphans, Prince Edward Island, and friendship. In the case of De Officiis, the book is about pastoral theology and Christian ethics. Our copy of the book also has the physical aspects of illuminations, marginalia, and a vellum binding. None of these things would be obvious or searchable from just the author, title, or imprint alone. Rare book catalogers also pay particular attention to copy-specific details. Because of the rarity of hand-pressed materials and the pre-industrial method of their production, variations amongst copies can hold important research information. Here we have made notes about the binding, which is bound in vellum or parchment, and also the illumination. And here's a closer view of the beautiful illumination in our copy. And we also make notes about margin notes or marginalia throughout the copy. Margin notes or other annotations can often offer insight into how readers engaged in the material. We have also added a note about the provenance or ownership history about the book. The source of acquisition note tells how the Huntington acquired this book. If we had additional information about previous owners, we would include that in notes. Information about provenance or the history of ownership of an item is of interest to many researchers and is also important evidence in identifying copies. Here is an example from the Glittering Plains, which Sarah showed you earlier. Local notes where we had much more information about the previous owners. Here, Beatrice Crane, Templeton Crocker, and then Sanford and Helen Berger, who were the people who gifted this collection to us. Again, we've added access points for various features of the copy. And in addition to the creators of the work, William Morris as the author and William Crane, the illustrator, we have access points for other agents involved in our local copy. The relationship terms following the names help explain the role each person played in the creation or the history of the book. In this case, Walter Crane is the illustrator for all copies of this edition of Glittering Plains. However, only our copy has an inscription and was subsequently owned by all of the people here listed as former owners. You will see that these entries in our catalog for other you will not see these entries in the catalog records for other copies of this book. And here are the ownership markings in the book itself. Why add access points? Why use controlled or standardized vocabularies? Controlled vocabularies like the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus allow consistent and focused searches within and across catalogs. For example, a keyword search for illuminations returns 247 results in our catalog. Since this is searching the word anywhere in the record, you can see the results may include many things not relevant to your search. The first book is about urban lighting in the United States, for example. It's not likely to contain medieval hand-painted illuminations or even illuminations from a 19th century copy, such as William Morris. However, a focus search for it in form genre for illuminations will return only those records for books which actually have illuminations in them, including the copy of De Officiis discussed today. Rare book catalogers also have to pay attention to evidence of the printing process itself. Remember, pre-1800, all books were printed and set by people. Books were created sheet by sheet on hand-operated presses. Portions of type could often be reset during the middle of a printing job in order to correct errors or make other changes. This can result in variations within an edition of or publication run of a single book. Such physical evidence can reveal a lot about the working process of a print house, labor practices, the availability of type and paper resources, and also the intentions of authors and editors as creations or changes are made in the text during a print job. As you can see, the creation of a book requires various layouts of type on sheets of paper, which are then folded into the pages we're familiar with. The format of a hand-pressed era book is defined by the number of folds a sheet of paper goes through to create the number of leaves, folio, quarto, octavo, etc. You can see that the typeset can take on various layouts depending on the format. This is the record for Nosce Tiepsum, published in London in 1599. Call number is 60921 if you're interested in looking it up in our catalog. As the notes in the record show, there are multiple variations in the typesettings used for this edition. The cataloger needs to check our copy closely to see which settings our conforms to. In our local Huntington copy, we have identified the settings of our copy as B2 and C2. I hope this very brief tour through the rare book cataloging records gives you a better understanding of the types of things we add to records to aid researchers in finding unique materials. I hope you're encouraged to try and search our library collections either in our classic catalog or in our Summon Discovery interface. I'll now hand you over to my colleague, Jasmine Rue-Pincham, who will show you how our reader services can assist you in finding resources for your research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dorothy. Hello, my name is Jasmine Rue-Pincham, and I am the Assistant Access Services Librarian here in the Reader Services Department. One way I describe my work is by guiding researchers to discover our special collections and connecting them with various library resources and services, even if those resources are found in another library, organization, or database. I will show you some resources that we have here at the Huntington and that are also available in libraries and archives closer to you. I hope this insight will help you get started or continue your research journey into William Morris's Kelmscott Press universe. Sarah and Dorothy spoke about a few examples of William Morris materials from our special collections. We also have secondary sources, known as our general collections, that support these primary and rare items. When first starting a research project, it can be difficult to know how to narrow your research focus. So, a good place to start would be with work that other researchers have performed and documented. These folks have likely handled the primary materials and consulted with curators, librarians, archivists, and conservators, and other experts to publish titles that create easier access points into the topic. In our general collections, we have secondary sources, which includes a selection of exhibition catalogs, bibliographies, and monographs about William Morris's Kelmscott Press. I will explain what these types of publications are and how they can help you further contextualize your research plan and goal. General collection items can provide context from a historical perspective, shed light on more recent excavations into the archive, or even show gaps of collective knowledge. It's an opportunity for you to decide how you can add to the community's knowledge base by expanding on previous research or following a different thread entirely. Let's start with exhibition catalogs. Whether permanent or temporary, exhibitions are curated experiences with objects under a specified theme. Many of you are likely avid museum attendees, so you may have your favorite exhibits that you like to visit and have committed many of those details to memory. But what about the items that were previously on display or were rotated out? Or what about the exhibitions that are out of reach by time and space? An exhibition catalog is a snapshot of how something was presented and its importance at the time, which may currently persist. So the first book I'd like to share is an exhibition catalog titled The Typographical Adventure of William Morris, an exhibition arranged by the William Morris Society, 1957. More on the society in a moment. The foreword states, this exhibition aims at showing what he achieved, with a great many subsidiary pieces throwing light on the aspirations of other great printers. Along with a brief biography of William Morris, the catalog provides a legend of how the exhibition was organized to give attendees a narrative experience. A total of 168 items were organized thematically to show William Morris's starting point, catalysts for change, progress with the Kelmscott Press, and more. This catalog provides descriptions of the displayed items along with their significance to Morris within the context of the exhibition. There aren't any photos of the items. However, there is plenty of text explaining the name of the work, a summary, the creator, and other physical descriptions. Thankfully, image searches from your internet browser should be able to show you the object if it has been digitized. For example, an image search for item number 3 of the exhibition, The Defense of Guinevere and Other Poems, shows the following results. However, upon further examination, the description in the exhibition catalog describes the book differently. The binding is supposed to be dark brown diced cloth with gilt lettering. So I added the publisher's Bell and Dowdy to the title in my image search and found these results. And now we have found the dark brown diced cloth binding and gilt lettering. We have further confirmation based on the exhibition catalog's description of the publisher's mark, consisting of a bell crossed over Aldous' mark, which is a dolphin wrapped around an anchor, on the title page. The University of Iowa Library's copy of this book has been digitized from cover to cover, and the link to this is being placed in the chat and will also be included in our LibGuide. Okay, so the William Morris Society was founded in 1955 in the United Kingdom. 2 years later, they were able to organize their first exhibition that was just discussed with the intention of making Morris, his friends, their work, and their ideals better known, in the belief that this knowledge is of value to the present-day world. If William Morris's works inspire you in any way, the Society is a great resource to stay connected to his continued influence. The Society also has a USA and Canadian counterpart, and the links to these web pages are also included in our LibGuide for this talk. Okay, so going back to their catalog of the Society's first exhibition, you can find many different directions to head in as next steps in your research. For example, the acknowledgements text mentions a great deal of gratitude towards scholars and researchers in the field whose works were indispensable in the preparation for the exhibition. From this list, I would like to highlight H. Halliday Sparling's The Kelmscott Press and William Morris Craftsman. In his preface, Sparling indicates that the purpose of writing this monograph was to further contribute his part to the knowledge of the life, times, and works of Morris. Briefly, a monograph is typically a book on a specialized topic by a single author. Sparling considered this title his own personal homage to William Morris. During the time that Sparling was employed by Morris, Sparling was deeply moved and inspired by Morris to the level of holding Morris in great reverence. Sparling seemed to recognize a great contemporary in Morris that would not merely influence art, but condition our thinking in the matters of art. This title was published in 1924, and as we already know, was a tremendous help for the William Morris typographical exhibition over 30 years later, providing behind-the-scenes context and more in-depth perspectives on Morris's thought process and application of his craftsmanship. This book has been digitized, and a link from the Internet Archive will be shared with you all. Sparling enriched his text with the addition of various appendices, including an annotated list of all the books printed at the Kelmscott Press in the order in which they were issued. However, the Huntington's copy of Sparling's work has its annotated list further annotated with Huntington call numbers. These call numbers are unique to the Huntington's cataloging system for our rare materials in the special collections. Huntington staff used this working title for cross-reference purposes, and this system was especially very helpful in the pre-online catalog days. Let's take a closer look at The Nature of Gothic, a chapter of the Stones of Venice. You may remember this image in the top left corner from this event's sign-up page. It shows a portion of the text and border from one of its pages. From the annotated list, in the margin to the right, we see a Huntington call number penciled in of 108403. So when this call number is typed into our online catalog, it pulls up the catalog record for our copy of The Nature of Gothic. We can indeed see that the notes from the annotated list are represented in the catalog record. However, the annotated list and the catalog records each provide further context to this item, with the annotated list including such information as John Ruskin, the author, considering this chapter, The Stones of Venice, to be the most important in the book, and that it was printed separately in 1854 as a 6-penny pamphlet. While the catalog record shows that our copy is a part of the Sanford and Helen Berger collection. If we search for this collection in our online catalog, if we search for this catalog in the online catalog, we can learn that from this finding aid that California architect Sanford L. Berger was a collector, student, and enthusiast of objects and knowledge related to William Morris. We can also see a bibliographic reference shown as BibRefs of Peterson, W.S. Kelmscott Press, A4. Okay, so when searching for sources, annotated bibliographies are very helpful tools that aim to provide a comprehensive overview of a particular topic while also adding brief explanations of each source's relevance, authority, and credibility. William S. Peterson is Emeritus Professor of University of Maryland and is considered one of the greatest authorities on the Kelmscott Press. Peterson is still active in the Kelmscott Press research community. As recently as spring of 2021, he gave a virtual lecture to the William Morris Society as part of a celebration of the 130th anniversary of the founding of the Kelmscott Press. This and other talks are available from the William Morris Society's online store. Okay. In this publication, Peterson states that this bibliography describes the published works of the Kelmscott Press, books that were contemplated but were not actually printed, and advertising circulars and other ephemera. A final section supplies the text of 8 contracts and memoranda for Kelmscott books. Going back to the bibliographic reference for the catalog record, we are looking for entry A4. From the table of contents, we see that the published works are categorized under section A, published works. Then we can leaf over to the 4th entry of this section to find the bibliographic information of John Ruskin's The Nature of Gothic, a chapter of the Stone of Venice. These catalog records are the Kelmscott Press books that Sarah showed you earlier. They also have bibliographic references from Peterson. We can see abbreviated descriptions of some of what Sarah pointed out to us in these bibliographies. Dorothy also mentioned that bibliographic references are helpful to catalogers in further identifying features for our own copies of titles. And you can see that this is also a working publication for staff from the penciled in Huntington call numbers and further notes related to the Huntington copies of these titles. These are only 3 titles of many in the Huntington's general collections related to the history of William Morris as a printer and his Kelmscott Press. There is plenty more to search and find, which I will leave for you to discover. Follow the threads that interest you and align with your related research goal or question. As you can see, the general collections are a great starting place for your research. You can search for these titles and more from WorldCat, worldcat.org. This incredible resource is a database that pulls information from library catalogs across the globe. It can tell you which libraries in your area have the book you're looking for and its available formats. From this type of initial research, you will be able to familiarize yourself with contemporaries and researchers of William Morris, as well as the enthusiasts who work to keep Morris's works relevant and continue to both educate and inspire. This episode of Multi-Storied Library has focused on William Morris's Kelmscott Press. However, I would be remiss if I did not mention how other areas of Morris's craftsmanship spreads beyond the printing press, from the art of the book to works of art. Renowned American artist Kehinde Wiley paints portraits with patterned backgrounds reminiscent of West African fabrics, as well as wallpaper and textile designs by William Morris and Company. As we have already seen, Morris's title pages were also quite ornate with floral designs. This can be seen here in the commissioned painting of a portrait of a young gentleman in the Huntington Art Gallery. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this has helped as a guidepost in your research journey of William Morris and the Kelmscott Press.
Thank you, Jasmine, Sarah, and Dorothy. That was some great information about the Huntington's collections and how we take care of them and how people can actually access them. We do have some time for a little bit of a Q&A, but first I just want to remind everyone that all of the links in the chat today will also be included on the library's LibGuide. And there will also be a recording of this presentation on the LibGuide in about a week or so. And with that, let's see. We've got a question here asking, could you explain the physical layout of a page? Did they print on both sides of a single piece of paper? And I think Sarah could take that possibly.
Yeah, David, if we could have the Kelmscott Press camera spotlighted for this. Okay. I know. Okay, can we see? Yeah. So this particular book is what we call folio size, and that means that it's made up of various pieces of paper folded in half once. And so one single piece of paper is actually going to be 4 pages of the book. So you can see there's text on both sides. And then because you can't just fold a whole stack of pages in half and bind them, each set of folded pages is gathered into what's called a signature or a quire, and that's going to be a smaller number of pages than the whole book. So you can see, hopefully you can see there are little divots there, like little scallops. And each one of those scallops represents a small gathering of sheets, which make up pages of the book. Hope that answers your question about layout.
Hey, thanks for that, Sarah. We have another question asking, can you share and discuss the material books are laying underneath? What is the rope-like holding book pages open material? Can a close-up be shown?
Yeah, so if we go back to the camera we were just on, the Kelmscott, okay, perfect. Maybe I'll see if I can raise this up a bit. So the book is on a cushion that's filled with little plastic beans. And so we kind of divide it in the center there so the spine has a place to land. And then we put the book in the center and prop it open. And this is to protect the binding of the book. We never want to put a book fully open because that puts a lot of strain on the binding. So this keeps it at an angle that's more, takes better care of the book. And then of course, the hazard there is that it's not going to stay open on the page that you want. So we use these weighted, what are called snakes, to kind of, inherently you're going to have to block the page a bit, but these snakes are really pretty narrow. So you can still see what you're looking at while they're laying open the book. I don't know if there's any more close-up necessary than that, but that's what we standardly use in our in our reading room here at the Huntington.
Great. Thank you for that, Sarah. We had another question about title pages and when title pages came into use.
That's a good question. Title pages were coming into use by really pretty soon after incunables were printed, so the early 16th century. Part of the reason for that is that as books, the printing press obviously totally exploded the number of books that could be made. So suddenly there were books being printed that needed to be stored. And as a result, if you started the text on the very first page, there was a good chance that that page was going to be lost in some way, just because it was in a stack with other books. The first and the last pages of a book are the most vulnerable. So if you move the first page of the text further into the text block, it's going to be more protected. So that's the reason why title pages started to kind of become more common.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. We do have a few more questions, but we are just about at time now. So if you did not have your question answered, in the chat, you'll find a link to our companion research guide, also known as a LibGuide, which will be on Huntington's website. And you'll also find the recorded version of this program there. Keep muting myself. But you will find a recorded version of this program on the LibGuide in about a week or so. Some of your questions could be answered there as well. All of the links that were placed in today's chat will be there. And there is a link to submit any further questions about research, accessing materials, or navigating digital resources. And if you did have a question that was not answered today, you could submit that there as well. So I want to thank everyone so much for tuning in to today's webinar, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you. Bye.